delivered by Vice Director of Academics. Please welcome the Honorable Mrs. Effie Mulyani.
Thank you. Thank you. Distinguished panelists, Bapak Mekar Satria Utama, Director of International Taxation, Ms. Laila Latif of University of Nairobi, and Ms. Wopke Helen from Deloitte Netherlands, distinguished discussant, Mr. Prem Kumar Baldesing from Capabuild, and Mr. Ferry Irawan of Polytechnic of State Finance, pekan, and distinguished guests, esteemed faculty members, and fellow students. Good afternoon to you all. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. It is my pleasure to welcome you to this webinar on the implementation of OECD's 2 pillars and the challenges that come with it. On behalf of Bapak Rahmadi Murwanto, the Director of pekan, I am Effie Mulyani, the Vice Director for Academics, and I am honored to address this gathering of bright minds eager to expand our knowledge and understanding of this crucial subject. It is through such intellectual engagements that we expand our horizons and equip ourselves with the knowledge necessary to navigate the complexities of the ever-evolving global landscape. Today, we gather here to shed light on the OECD's 2-pillar plan, a groundbreaking proposal for international tax reform. And it is imperative that we, as students, future leaders, and policymakers, take a keen interest in this subject because it holds far-reaching implications for the future of our global economy. The global economy is rapidly evolving, with the digitalization and globalization transforming the way we do business and communicate. The massive digital business across countries have yielded enormous transactions, leading to taxable profits, which have to be addressed well through international agreements. The international tax system has to keep its pace with these circumstances, preventing its system from becoming outdated and open to abuse. And the main starting point is the condition where multinational companies are able to shift profits to low tax jurisdictions, avoiding paying their fair share of taxes in the countries where they generate their profits. It undermines public trust in the fairness of the tax system and deprives governments of vital revenue needed to fund public services like healthcare and education. And the OECD's 2 pillars aim to address these challenges by reforming the international tax system. Pillar 1 seeks to ensure that the income from digital transactions held by overseas companies will be able to be taxed under the disregard of their physical presence. The traditional permanent establishment definition will evolve into the significant presence with broader definition. And on the other hand, Pillar 2 will come up with 2 plans, namely Global Anti-Base Erosion Rules, GLOBE, with its minimum effective income tax rate applied by domicile country for multinational enterprises with revenues above the threshold and subject to tax rule. Of course, with its certain withholding tax rate applied by source country. These pillars aim to prevent harmful tax competition across countries and create a more level playing field for businesses. Implementing the 2 pillars will not be without challenges, we understand that, but they represent an important step forward in promoting a fairer and more efficient international tax system that better reflects the realities of the global economy. Now, some of you may be wondering, why do we as students need to learn about these seemingly intricate and complex concepts? What is the significance of comprehending the OECD's 2 pillars and their potential impact on us? Firstly, as future business leaders, policymakers, and academics, it is essential that we grasp the intricacies of the international tax system. The implementation of the 2 pillars will shape the rules governing global taxation, and our understanding of these rules will be instrumental in crafting effective strategies and policies that then promote economic growth and social welfare. Furthermore, the 2-pillar plan represents a fundamental shift in the way multinational enterprises conduct their businesses. And by familiarizing ourselves with these changes, we position ourselves as informed professionals capable of navigating the complexities of the global marketplace. This knowledge will enable us to adapt to new realities, seize emerging opportunities, and contribute effectively to the organizations and societies we serve. By understanding the OECD's two pillars and their potential to combat these issues, we can play a significant role in promoting a more equitable society. Accurate policies and strategies can lead the government to actualize better welfare to the society through more enhanced taxation system. And I'm optimistic by joining this webinar, we can equip ourselves with a unique perspective necessary to navigate the fair international taxation system and contribute meaningfully to the academic discourse on international tax reform and related fields. I would like then to end my remarks by extending my gratitude to our distinguished panelists and discussants, and by wishing everyone a successful and productive seminar. Thank you. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh.
Waalaikumsalam warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Thank you very much for the keynote speech, Mrs. Evie. But please don't leave the forum first, because right now we are going to capture this moment. So for everyone, could you please turn on your camera? We are gonna take 3 captures. So prepare your best pose. The count is on me. The first pose may be like the formal one. Just smile and give your best smile to others. Let me see, is there anyone who give me best smile? All right, I think everyone is ready. So first capture, formal pose. Count on me, start it in 3, 2, 1. All right, hold on. Second capture, maybe like the famous one, heart finger pose. All right. Start it in 3, 2, 1. Last capture. Last capture, I just give you the best pose, okay? 3, 2, 1. All right. Thank you very much, everyone. Thank you very much, Mrs. Effie. All right, we are about to start our forum today, but before that, we have prepared olive question, which will be delivered by my friend, Gary. Gary from Capobuild. Are you there, Gary?
Yes, I am, and it's lovely to be able to join you. I hope you are doing well.
I'm happy to see you. I don't know. I think I've seen your face in somewhere. I don't know where, but I think I have. All right, Gary, without any further ado, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, and it's a real honor for us at Capabuild to be able to work with PK and Stan once again and to be able to join you for this webinar. To get things started, we love to hear your opinion. And so what we're going to do is run an anonymous poll, and that's going to ask you your current knowledge at the start of this webinar and what you already know about the topic that we're going to be talking about today. So what I would ask you to do is there's going to be a address that's going to be dropped into the chat in just a moment. And that address will ask you just one very simple question. And so if you can please click on that address and go to that link that's there for you. Now, it's very important that this question is anonymous. It's going to ask you what your knowledge of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 is. No one will know what you selected, because we just want to know that your truthful understanding of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, this very important principle in international tax. And so once you've gone there, we'll actually display those answers, the results of you as our participants. And then at the end of the webinar, we'll revisit this question and we'll get a chance to see just how much the dial has shifted, if you like, and how much your knowledge has changed. There is an amazing group of professionals in tax who are going to speak to you today. And so what I can actually do now is I can see that lots of you have already started to enter your responses here. And please don't be influenced by what you see on your screen, because it is really just your opinion and you are not being judged or tested here. But it's very interesting to see that we are starting from a level where 68% of the respondents are saying that they know virtually nothing. So you're in for a treat today, those of you who are saying that your knowledge is quite limited. There's about a quarter of the respondents are saying that they have a basic knowledge, and then a few more are a little bit more confident. We have about 9% there. But it's very interesting to see, and I know that the Capable team in Rotterdam will be watching this with great interest, because they're going to be talking about this later on today. So lots more responses are flowing in, but it seems to be around about there, where we have 2/3 of respondents who know virtually nothing, and then about a quarter who are building their knowledge, and then some with more confidence. So thank you very much for allowing us to run that poll, Ev. You'll see me again towards the end of the webinar, where we'll see if there's been any improvement there. Thank you.
Thank you, Gary. All right, from the poll question session, I knew that 68% of our participants is not knowing virtually the global pillars or the specific topic of our topic right now. But before that, I think we should give them some imagination or some descriptions about what are we going to talk about. So, here among us today, Mr. Ferry Irawan, lecturer of PKN STAN, who will enlighten our minds about our particular topic. Ladies and gentlemen, I would like to introduce to you. He is Mr. Ferry Irawan. Ferry Irawan is a scientist and accountant by background, worked for Directorate General of Taxation in Indonesia for various roles, including dealing with transfer pricing issues, audit, APA, MAP, and transfer pricing risk. He complemented master degrees in applied economics, public policy, and management. He is a very experienced lecturer, and since 2016, he is assistant professor and researcher at PKN STAN, focusing on transfer pricing and international tax. All right, without any further ado, ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Mr. Ferry Irawan.
Okay, thank you. Can you hear my voice clearly?
Yes, of course.
Okay, yeah. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen, all distinguished speakers and panelists, and also the audience. Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Assalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Good afternoon. Hello, everyone, and welcome to today's session. It is a great opportunity for me joining this webinar and meeting you all. And in this occasion, I also like to share maybe a bit elaboration concerning the global tax policy and how it can affect the emerging economies, including Indonesia. Please allow me to share. Okay. Wait up. Sorry. Okay. Yeah. So today I would like to share with you all about how the global tax policy has mentioned and elaborated earlier by Ibu Evi and also the host. And I think Ibu Evi has already explained very in a detailed way. But in this opportunity, I would like to maybe give some additional information and also explanation from the perspective of the academician, of course. Okay, maybe this is the, what is it? Let's say, we can say this is a data telling us about how the economic worldwide and also in several region in the world. We have 4 graphs here. The first graph and the second graph is about the GDP development. Okay, we can see after the COVID pandemic, 2020 until 2022 maybe, yeah? The end of 22. We have all suffered from the pandemic, but in 2021, we can see that the GDP, both the worldwide and also the Asia Pacific and also in selected low middle countries, including Indonesia. So I have selected several countries here: Indonesia, India, Bangladesh, Egypt, the Arabians, and then the Republic Islamic Iran and Vietnam and also Pakistan. We can see that we can now, try to go back to our capacity. And also in the graph 3 and 4, we can see the trade both in the world and also the in the Asia Pacific indicates the increasing of the value or the number of the trade. So this is becoming what we say as a good news for us, of course, that even though we all suffer from the COVID-19 pandemic, but together we can grow and we can strong side by side to help each other. But anyway, the World Economic Forum reported that we are now facing a potential global recession in 2023 or this year. The World Forum reported that 86%, okay, maybe firms or companies, they try to reduce costs by cutting operational expenses, and then 78%, it also will reduce the cost by laying off workers, and 77% optimize the supply chain. What can we understand from this information? In the recession, we know that the demand from the demand side, maybe it will decrease or dramatically decrease, and also from the supply side, maybe we cannot rely on how the previous demand occurred. So that even though the previous slide shows us a good news, but then this slide show us not a bad news, but it's a challenge. It's quite challenging for us to, maybe to tackle or to handle or maybe to cope this problem together. And we believe that based on the experience, we can overcome the COVID-19 pandemic together. And now I think, I strongly believe in personal that we can do it also together. Okay, so this is the situation that occurs to us. Maybe a few days ago, the audiences and also the speakers and panelists, also maybe you watch from the TV or hear from the media that in the United States, the situation of economic is also not in a good condition. So maybe it will bring impact to the other countries, maybe including Indonesia and also the other developing countries. So that is the situation that we face in these weeks or in this month. Okay. Now, taken from the research conducted by Alvarez Martinez in 2022, the study shows that the impact of profit shifting in several countries, okay, maybe in this table they show in the developed countries, many countries suffers. Okay, many countries suffer from the profit shifting. There are 5 columns, except the first column, the countries. So the first column is gain, and then the second is loss. The third is net. The fourth is loss based on CIT revenues, and the fifth is loss based on the GDP. The first column tell us that countries can gain from the profit shifting. So it means the profit shifting that conducted maybe by the MNE or the multinational companies bring benefit to these countries, okay? And then it's represented by gain. For example, like France, Germany, the Netherlands, Spain, UK, and then USA and Japan, except Japan maybe, okay? The rest countries obtain gain from the profit shifting action conducted by the multinational enterprise. But on the other hand, they also suffered loss. Okay, the potential tax revenue is gone. Okay, gone from their country, like France. Okay, maybe this country suffered the most in the Europe. It suffered around 2,867 million, okay, in euro. And then Germany also, the Netherlands, the Spain, even though some countries maybe still get net, okay? Net means it gain compared to the loss, and it still get beneficial from the profit shifting. Let's say we have here the Netherlands, maybe Pak Prem or maybe the speakers, Ibu Oke or Pak Sebastian maybe can explain. They got gain from the profit shifting. They have a positive value. Anyway, even though those countries get gain and loss, but we can see in general, these countries are suffering from the revenue, especially from the CIT. CIT means corporate tax, right? Or PPh Badan. So this is the situation where countries are suffering from the profit shifting conducted by companies, especially the multinational companies. Okay. We know that the global tax policy can be established or formulated by considering several variables or several factors. At least in this opportunity, I would like to introduce only 4 variables or factors. First is the SDGs. Right? The SDGs are Sustainable Development Goals, especially in the SDG number 8, that the goals of the world or the countries in the world is to establish the economic growth and also the opportunity to better work for people. Okay, so I mean, before we formulate or establish a global tax policy or a tax policy that give impact worldwide, we should first consider this. Okay, because this has become the general guidance for all countries to develop their own tax system or tax policy. And then maybe the second is the country's sovereignty. Okay, the freedom of countries to regulate, to make tax rules based on their own interests. Okay, I think there is also the second factors that we should consider. And then the third one is the legal system. We know that in general we have two legal system, the common law and also the civil law. Of course, the different law will bring different impact, both in the domestic and also in the global area. Okay, maybe different situation, different term in business, but if we have a different legal system, okay, it can bring a challenge for us how to deal with it. And then as an accountant, I see that the reporting standard is also should be considered. Okay, the unity of the global tax policy proposed by the OECD and the G20, on the other hand, in one hand, is a sound practice or sound proposal for us. But on the other hand, we also should consider that each country has a typical in their own reporting standard, even though we have now the IFRS accounting standard, but we have each country has a typical the characteristic of the reporting standard, and it also should be considered. So why I explain this? Because most of us think that to formulate the global tax policy, we should only consider about the tax avoidance, tax evasion, the potential tax revenue that missing because of the action of or the activities of the multinational corporation. But I think it's not only that. Okay. And then the OECD report, maybe some of you or most of you are already seen this. The OECD reported that around 135 countries and jurisdictions collaborate on BEPS package, and then around $240 billion are lost annually due to the tax avoidance. Okay, and then around 100 countries and jurisdictions have joined MLI and BEPS. So this is the key figures compiled by the OECD, and this has become our concern because the loss or the annual loss caused by the tax avoidance is not a small amount, right? It's $240 billion annually each year. And then, so what is the situation here? We know that the tax avoidance is really disturbing the tax authorities, okay? And then the OECD together with the G20, they are formulating the BEPS action plan, consists of 15 BEPS action plan. And then they also add the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 to strengthen the BEPS action plan, because some action plan may be inefficient or not strong enough to combat the tax avoidance conducted by the multinational companies or enterprises. So this is maybe the definition of the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 already explained or already elaborated by Ibu Evi and also the host just now. What I can explain or I can add from the Pillar 1 is the Pillar 1 addresses the digital taxation. So the objective of the Pillar 1 is to give profit allocation in a more fair and equal by reallocate the taxing right, okay, to the source country without consider the physical existence. It also the extension on BEPS Action Plan 1, okay, and in the technical way, it used the residual profit split method. Maybe some students who studied the international tax course, you are already read or studied this, okay. And then the Pillar 2, what is the Pillar 2? The Pillar 2 the background of the Pillar 2 is to overcome the race of the BEPS. Okay, this is addresses the global minimum tax. So every multinational enterprises or company that operate in certain country, they should pay at least certain tax rate. Okay, as mentioned earlier, it's around 15%. That is the idea. And then the Pillar 2 is also direct extensions of TCGA. And the Pillar 2 is also try to allocate taxing right to the country of the parent. And it focus on enhanced rules around CFC to allocate more revenue to resident jurisdiction. So the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 is still discussing, and maybe Pak Mekar later on will explain more about the update of the Pillar and Pillar 2. But this is the scope or the simple definition of Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. So the point is how to tax or how to get the tax revenue in a more fair and more efficient. Okay, based on the elaboration earlier, maybe there are some points that we can discuss later on. First is Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 are established based on the developed countries' perspective, because it is proposed by the OECD and the G20. And maybe should the discussion involve more developing countries? And then the second one is developing countries need to attract investment to boost their economic growth, right? So if the MNE, let's say we ask them, we force them to pay a certain tax rate, what about the tax holiday that we offer? What about the tax incentive that we prepare for investment, okay, to get into Indonesia? And then for developing countries, okay, Pillar 1 might be interesting, but Pillar 2 should be prudently considered. This is what I can see from the discussion in the OECD and also the G20. And the third one, maybe, the accounting standard may need to be adjusted. Okay, this is maybe simple and not becoming a certain point to discuss. But in a more technical way, sometimes it is hard to determine how much the profit of a firm. Should we use EBIT or EBITDA, earning before interest and tax, or earning before interest, tax, and depreciation and amortization? Because there's an idea that maybe the depreciation and amortization should be excluded. Okay, and then also the application of arm's length principle. I don't know whether by Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 application, are we going to modify the arm's length principle, which is the arm's length principle is a principle that we know from the when we are learning the accounting. Okay, that is the third the three things then that maybe we can discuss later on. Okay, thank you for the opportunity, and I give to the house. The time is yours. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Ferry Irawan, for the abstract, I could say. Coming up next is the main forum, which is a roundtable conversation, which will be led by the Honorable Mr. Prem Kumar Baltasing. But before that, I would like to introduce to you. He is Prem Kumar Baltasing. Prem Kumar Baltasing is seasoned international tax trainer. He has extensive experience in international tax arena, including in senior tax positions within financial industry sector, the Big Four, law firms, and knowledge institutions. Prem Kumar has been a senior registrar at the tax chamber at the Court of Appeal in The Hague for 4 years. He has over 10 years experience as a tax trainer in Europe, Africa, and Asia. Prem has a master's degree in tax law from University of Leiden. With passions and calmness, he explains the most difficult international tax issues in such a detailed and accessible way that has made him one of the world's most popular trainers. Alright, ladies and gentlemen, without any further ado, please welcome Mr. Prem Kumar Baltasing.
Okay. Just a sound check. Can I proceed? There is some feedback. Sound. Yeah, okay, but we should limit the feedback.
Alright, I
Okay.
think your voice is quite clear.
Hello, everyone. It's disturbing. Yeah? Yeah, hello, everyone. Again, I have the privilege and pleasure today to moderate this panel session. You know, my experience is that if you look at recent webinars, that most of the webinars on this topic, the global pillars, the speakers tend to directly dive into technical details, which is, it's my experience, is a bit boring. You know, the technical details of the globe rules, for instance, they read like a phone book. And there are all kinds of referrals from one article to the other one. So we are not going to discuss those technical details. These are subjects for other webinars. What we are going to do today in this panel is that we will focus on the underlying tax policies and politics of the two-pillar framework. And we would love to hear the different views and thoughts of the panel members. And remember, that's for the panel members, there is no right or wrong answer. It's all about a respectful exchange of views, so that the students could broaden their thinking about the two pillars that currently keep the global tax world very busy. My role as moderator is that I will do a bit of the talking, and the panel members will do the most of the talking. So it's relatively easy. Nevertheless, I have to closely watch the process and the time, since we have 1 hour only. So let's directly dive into a basic question, but nevertheless an important question. And the question to each panel members is, do you think that Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 will happen? And please give a short answer, like yes or no, or optimistic or pessimistic for each pillar. And let me start with Pak Ferry. So the question, do you think Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 will happen?
Yeah, okay, thank you, Pak Prem. Okay, Pak Prem. Yeah. Well, I guess the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 will happen. So there are several reasons. First, the OECD and the G20 is seriously develop and formulate this, and also has considered the costs and the cons, the pros and the cons, and also the benefit. We know that each policy can always raise a problem, but the tax avoidance that occurs in these years is also a serious problem that we should tackle, that we should face. And I believe that Pillar 1, based on the, if I'm not mistaken, in 2024, will be launched by the OECD and the G20. I think that's it for me, Pak. Thank you.
Thanks, Perry. And Pak Mekar, is he Is he there?
Yes, I am, Pak Prem. Thank you. It's nice to see that you are wearing batiks like I am. Short sleeve also.
I don't see you.
Can you see now? Yes, Pak Prem. Can you see? Can you hear my voice?
I can hear a voice, but where are you on the screen? Yeah.
I'm in the big screen. I see you also in big screen. Okay, based on your questions, Pak Prem, let me just answer. It's quite surprising for me that Pak Perry also mentioning that yes, it will happen, because I thought that as academics, the person that you are still skeptical about Pilar 1 and Pilar 2. For Pilar 2, we are more confident regarding the framework, legal framework already established. Now we also starting to implement in our domestic regulations for Pilar 2 continue to establish. Some countries we understand that already stated that they were going to implement Pilar 2 in 2024. That a good news for us. So we believe Pilar 2 may be more smoothly implemented. But for Pilar 1, we understand that some obstacles still being discussed right now. But as a member of a steering group, inclusive framework, I still convinced, I'm optimistic that we will reach conclusions, and we are going to have Pilar 1 also in the near future. Thank you, Pak Prem.
Thanks. Clear answer. And let's move to Ulaila. What's your reaction on this question?
Thank you, Asante. Thank you, Prem. Assalamu alaikum to everyone. It's so nice to see all of you here. Prem, you've asked a question which is very complex, and I want to give you a setting stone for this. Now, 4 out of 54 African countries are still figuring out what they need to do in terms of implementing either Pillar 1 or Pillar 2. South Africa, 1 out of the 54 African nations, is the only country that has said that we are ready to start implementing this by 2025. Nigeria has rejected the entire process. Kenya rejected the entire process, but now it's back on the drawing board, trying to figure out how do we implement either Pillar 1, Pillar 2, because of our new president who's now kind of favoring the OECD approach. Mauritius is another country that has passed its Finance Act 2022 to say we're ready to implement the qualified minimum domestic top-up tax. So these are only 4 countries. 2 have rejected. 1 is ready for 2025. 1 is saying that we're only going to take up a portion of Pillar 2, nothing else. Now you tell me, is Africa ready?
No, Africa is not. And I will give some comments on that. We have 2 esteemed panel members here next to me. Pak Sebastian, what's your view on this question?
Yeah, thanks very much, Prem, and thanks for the organization for also inviting myself. I'm working for Unilever, so I'm VP Tax with Unilever. And to your question, I think there's a difference probably between Pillar 2. So I'm 100% convinced Pillar 2 will actually happen. So we already see in the EU, in the UK, in various Asian markets where Pillar 2 has actually been legislated or in the process of being effective. And for me, the biggest question is actually not so much whether it will happen, but whether jurisdictions will implement the full package or maybe whether they only choose to implement qualifying domestic minimum top-up taxes, as was also just said for some African countries. And then on Pillar 1, I'm a bit more skeptical. So I know that there's enormous amount of work still being done by the OECD and the inclusive framework to develop the rules. But first of all, I have a couple of questions there. One, will they actually get consensus and will they come to a common view on how Pillar 2 rules should be designed? And then the other bigger question is, I think, will some of the key markets where we are expecting Pillar 2 to have most impact, Pillar 1, apologies, will they actually ratify and implement the legislation? So I'm a bit more skeptical on Pillar 1. On Pillar 2, I think it will happen, and it's already happening.
Okay, thanks. Last but not least, Boer Wopke, what's your view?
Yeah, thanks. Well, for those of you that don't know me that well, I mostly help from a Deloitte perspective companies to prepare for Pillar 2 and then the multinationals. So everybody, I think, is operating, or most multinationals, on the basis that it will happen. The difficulty is that we do expect it will be different in each and every country. So for a multinational to deal with the extra set of data and processes that they need to start implementing to be compliant if and when this happens, that's going to be the big challenge. But the simple answer is yes, I do think it will happen in whatever shape or form.
Both pillars?
Well, I think I'm with Sebastian on that. I think Pillar 1, I'm also a bit more skeptical based on what I'm hearing.
Yeah. And okay, I will give you my perspective, if I may. What I've seen is that the US is very reluctant that Pillar 1 will happen. And why is that? Because it is inherent to their system, their legislative system, because Pillar 1 needs a multilateral instrument to come into force. And the US is blocked between the two parties, the Democrats on the one side and the Republicans on the other side, and you need in the Senate a 2/3 majority in order to sign a multilateral agreement. So given that situation in the US, my take is that the chance that Pillar 1 will happen is close to 0. Pillar 2, I see a different development worldwide. I see a lot of countries either in the process of preparing themselves or in the process of involving stakeholders via consultations, public consultations. Some countries are in the process of drafting legislation which should be in line with the globe rules. And some countries already have legislation in place. Like in the Far East, we have Japan, we have South Korea, we have Hong Kong, Singapore. And these are, for Indonesia, from an Indonesian perspective, these are important countries because a lot of FDIs are coming from those countries. But there are two important countries in the Far East from whom we don't know exactly what their position is. Those two countries are, on the one hand, China. China holds its cards close to its chest, so we don't know what China is thinking. And the same with India. We know that they have to move, but how they will move, we don't know. We are not certain yet. I think they're also looking at what will be happening in the US with regard to this Pillar 1 proposal. So that's a bit. In Europe, we see that for Pillar 2, there is a directive, and I think that this directive has sort of speeded up the process, and you see that countries are following with rules regarding Pillar 2. I'm not sure whether they have thought it well to legislate Pillar 2. Sometimes I think, yeah, they are fearing of losing something, and if they see that 27 countries in the EU are going to legislate Pillar 2, and there are a number of other countries in the Far East, that countries are more inclined to also follow. So going back to Pak Ferry and Pak Mekar, I think 3 members of this panel are far more reluctant on Pillar 1 to go through. If I compare it to you guys said Pillar 1 will happen. Do you have any comments on what you have heard so far, Pak Ferry?
Yeah, in my opinion, the Pillar 1 is quite relevant to Indonesia since there are the development of digital economy coming from overseas to Indonesia, and we need the tax authority of Indonesia need to tax them fairly and also effectively, and that's why from the two pillars, I think that the Pillar 1 is the even though Pak Mekar said that we have already prepared all the stuff in Pillar 2, but Pillar 1 will also becoming a potential to be applied in order to optimize the tax revenue, I think.
Okay.
Yeah.
Pak Mekar?
Well, for Pillar 1, I think that still beneficial for not only for tax administrations but also for taxpayers to have multilateral measures regarding these digital tax services. This Pillar 1, I mean. This can also beneficial for countries like United States. Compare that they have to deal with each country one by one. It's better that if we have one agree or one models that already been agreed by many countries, and it is also beneficial for big MNEs because they now have more certainty, and also it is better to calculate their future business model. That is what I thought still one of the biggest issue why we still believe that we are going to have the agreement during the last meeting at least until the end of the 2023 because it's already been stated on the commitment before. If by the end of 2023 there is no agreement, no signing of MLC, each country can go with their own unilateral measures. We do understand that unilateral measures is more tax revenue we can get for each country, but in the long run, we don't think that it is very good measures, and it still have issues of double tax that we have to deal with other jurisdictions. As a member of steering group, we still optimistic. We are still discussing this. We understand that some technical issue is being discussed between members, but I see that there is a consensus. We are nearing the understanding. Some country must have. I think every country must have the what we call compromise. The end result may be not the ideal model for each country, but at least we have some models that can be used across the country, can give more certainty both to the tax administration maupun all our taxpayer. Thank you, Fred.
Okay. Thanks so far. To summarize, I think we here in the studio in Rotterdam, we are more, we don't think that Pillar 1 will get to the finish in this form. And again, that's because you need the US to have a multilateral instrument. In the announcements by the OECD says you need to have a critical mass for Pillar 1 to go through. And from the approximately 100 multinationals which fall within the scope of Pillar 1, more than 50, I think around 50, between 50 and 60% relate to US multinationals. These are the big parties. And given the fact that if Pillar 1 goes through, that the US will lose tax base in favor of the other countries, I don't think it will happen. So perhaps Pak Mika has other information because he's close to the fire from his function. But let's move on to the next point. And the next point deals with recent developments. And I would like to give you first some context before I go into the question. And the context is that in November 2022, Nigeria, on behalf of a group of African states, proposed a UN resolution to take steps needed to ensure real inclusive international tax cooperation and coordination. In December 2022, so 1 month later, the United Nations General Assembly adopted a resolution whereby the UN Secretary General is asked to prepare a report dealing with the need to strengthen international cooperation on tax matters in a more inclusive, there you have the same word, more inclusive intergovernmental forum. And this report should provide the basis for further discussion during the UN General Assembly session to take place later this year. Also, the UN Tax Committee has published what they are doing right now. Part of their work is that they are working on they are preparing what they call a fast track instrument, which is in fact a multilateral instrument. And the multilateral instrument will deal with trying to include Article 12A and 12B. 12B deals with the digitalization of the economy and the subject to tax rules. So also from that side, you see a development in and from the UN. And also last month, the G24 and the G24 are 24 emerging markets and developing economies. Indonesia is part of them. So these G24 countries announced their strong support of the UN General Assembly's resolution. And on top of that, we have Professor Jarif Browner from Florida. He is heavily involved in the UN as an observer. He said, quote, "The UN is the only possible forum for inclusive and effective international cooperation on tax matters." And next to him, Professor Philip Baker, a well-known scholar in tax matters, he said that the OECD is not the right body. It is not an institution that was set up to give equal involvement from all countries. It is dominated by the central group of OECD member countries. So my question to the panel is whether the OECD inclusive framework is the right institution to go ahead with reforming the international tax architecture, or should the UN be a better body to take on this task? I would like to start because the initiative came from the African continent. So I would like to start with Laila giving comments on these developments.
Thank you, Prem. It's a very, very provocative issue for many of us on the continent, because I myself come from a post-colonial society, and having studied the way in which the African fiscal space has shaped based on authoritative and authoritarian demands from external players, we do not view the OECD as the proper, legitimate, and correct institution to be able to discuss or lead any discussions on the reform of international tax norms, or even designing new tax norms as we go forward. And our reasons are that we still view the OECD body as colonial and capitalistic. We still feel it has hegemonic powers that are not attuned or aligned towards African interests. And you will see that in the way in which the discussions happened for Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. and how even the ATAF proposals that were made were being ignored and not really considered properly. We feel that the OECD is crafted to lobby only for the interests of white, racial, capital, and therefore we feel that the United Nations would be the proper, legitimate, democratic, and inclusive body where we're going to have all 54 views of the African countries actually heard. And why I say this, let me substantiate before we have a discussion going forward on this. The Tax Justice Network, it produced a report whereby it said that the G7 countries, which is home to about 10% of the world population, is going to get about 60% of the new tax revenue that is going to be generated under Pillar 2. Low-income countries, which make the majority of the African countries, will only take about 3%. There's no equality here. Number two, there's this argument that of the global minimum tax, we should be pegged at about 15%. Now, many low middle income countries have higher corporate income tax rates, right? And they rely on this source heavily. So our tax rate is between 30 to 35%. And ATAF went ahead to propose, and they said 15% is concerning. It's taking us to a race to the bottom. So they proposed, they said, okay, take an average of all African countries of their corporate income tax, which falls between 27.5%, and it was rejected. This means that we're losing the fiscal space when we peg international tax norms, tax rules, tax law decisions with the OECD. Finally, when we think about what is available for reallocation in terms of profit, it's only they say under Pillar 2, it's only 25% of residual profits. Now, ATAF, remember, they began pushing for an increase of this percentage to either 30 to 35%. And we also had the G24 countries try and push this percentage to about 30%. Then there was the Oxford Economic Study. And this particular study said that having the residual profits pegged at 25% is actually negative for many low middle income countries, because that would result in a loss of $230 million US. They also said that if the ATAF proposal of 35% was taken for these residual profits, it would generate about $857 million for African countries. Now, when we have statistics like this, and then when we see that our leaders, when they go and discuss these proposals before the OECD and they're shut down, then obviously many of us on the continent feel that the OECD is not the proper representative of African interests. Thank you.
Thanks, Laila. Now you are talking about the African continent. Just a side issue, but very important in this context, is that, let's say 2 years ago, there were 4 human rights experts, including Professor Atiya Waris, who is in the supervisory board of Capabuild. They sent a letter to the OECD that they were concerned that Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 would not be in accordance with human rights. And the chair of the Center of Tax Policy and Administration at the OECD sent an answer back to these 4 experts and said, if you cannot come to me with these complaints, you have to complain at the inclusive framework. A very short, straightforward letter. And I think human rights is very important, and tax and human rights, they are sort of linked together, because you need the revenue to develop your country, and including human rights. So, Laila, now you are talking about this. This seems to me as an extra argument to go for the UN, because the UN has that mandate regarding human rights, which the OECD doesn't have. Do you agree with that? And what is the current status of that letter?
I absolutely agree with you, Prem. And the fact that that letter was sent, it was highly in time that it was sent. It should have been sent many, many years ago. But you could see from the response, right? And the response is currently related to what I have just said, that the view is entirely colonial and capitalistic in its nature. So despite having that letter, despite having views coming out, and despite the civil society movements to move the tax discussions to the UN, the OECD inclusive framework is not really changing its views. All they say is that, okay, right now we have 138 countries that have signed up to IF. That shows momentum, that shows democracy. But when you really look at the nitty-gritties of the way in which this decision-making is taking place, it's not really impacting the African continent. Logan Wart, who's the director for ATAF, he just said, I think in the last webinar when he was having the discussion with the OECD people, there was a document that was sent to him at 10 p.m. at night for decisions to be made the next day in the morning. So how do we even talk about inclusivity and equality, having this discussion at the OECD level? So even the status of that letter, in context of what's really happening, the lived realities of political institutions and the politicians themselves who are discussing these matters at the OECD, is still not being taken into context. And that is why it's really, really key that these discussions move towards the United Nations. But again, there's so much of, there's a need for political consensus on this. There's a need to be able to look at the budget that's going to be available for the UN to be able to have these discussions, which budget is immensely coming from the global north. So it's a catch-22 situation, Prem. I hope I've answered you.
Thanks. I want to move on to the other panel members, and I want to give them that both Laila and myself, we presented a lot of smoking guns, that the OECD is not the right body going forward with shaping the international tax architecture. And we are not on our own. I've summarized also some scholars. I have summarized, Laila has given some examples from an African perspective. So my question let's start with Pak Mekar. How do you look at, what are your thoughts about this question, whether the UN should take over the lead in shaping international taxation?
Okay, thank you, Prem. Well, both institutions, OECD or UN, I believe capable of playing roles in reforming the international tax architecture. We understand that UN is long known as more favorable to the interests of developing countries. But we understand also that now the OECD also getting more inclusive. Laila also already mentioned that there are over 135 countries and jurisdictions working together within OECD or G20 inclusive framework on BEPS. We understand that with participations about 70% of non-OECD and non-G20 countries from all geographic regions, developing countries' perspective and inputs are increasingly influencing the development of international taxation standard. That is the current situation right now. One of the aim of the development of international tax architecture is create a fair system, which means the interests of both developed and developing countries need to be considered. We understand that it really, we cannot see this black and white situations, but we need also to give a compromise. Now we have more than 70% of the OECD. So I think this is still can be considered good institutions to reform the international tax architecture. We understand also UN, regarding Pilar 1, UN also has the models that already been discussed, Article 12A or 12B especially, but still we need to have the approval of its jurisdictions if you want to implement the Article 12B of the UN model. And also we need also cooperations with many developed jurisdictions where many of our biggest MNEs are located there. So still there is no win-win situations. We can move both ways. We can see which one can have more beneficial outcome for each jurisdiction. Thank you.
Itu model kita pasang di Undang-Undang 36 bahwa kalau membakar itu pidana. Kita pasang di Undang-Undang Perkebunan itu bilang bahwa kalau ada kebakaran di membakar lahan itu pidana.
clear, and thank you for being very open and honest on that. I think I can add that what I hear from my sources in a country like India, which is becoming more, important in the Far East, that moving from the OECD to the UN is like music in their ears. India is for a long time is a proponent of more UN involvement, which read more inclusiveness. So that having said that, I want to go to
Pak Sebastian.
how do you look at some from
Your perspective and this question. Is the time of the OECD as the leader in international taxation, is it over? And is the UN already ready to take over that task?
Thanks for the question. And of course, I work for a company, so I'm myself not involved in OECD nor UN discussions, but I do observe, I think, a couple of points and understand them as well, actually. So there's a real issue and challenge, I think, around inclusiveness on the current OECD IF framework. So that started not per se with the current discussions, in my view, on Pillar 1 and 2, but also on the BEPS action package, which was delivered already in 2015, and the way to become an IF member, I think, at that time. So it's a long history, I think, of this discussion, and therefore also very logical, I think, that now on when we see revenue statistics or expectations on Pillar 1 and 2 revenue, and there was just a reference to how developed markets are presumably benefiting versus developing economies, that this discussion is now full on the stage. So from that perspective, I fully understand. And I think there's a couple of key issues there which probably need attention. So one is, how do you really create participation on equal footing? So how do you make all parties equally participating in the discussion? How do you make it more transparent? So public participation, because a lot happens, I think, which was also referred to in smaller discussion groups, which are not publicly and transparently open to all. And how, in the end of the day, you create something which is coherent, so globally applied, because it's a global problem. So I think it's a global solution that is needed. But you also need to make it simple, because otherwise, developing markets, which maybe have less capability, less resources, are unable to fully implement the rules. That can also not be the outcome. Then to your very difficult question, I think, of is it one or the other? Is it the OECD that needs to leave the stage, or is it the UN that needs to step up? Yeah, in my view, you probably need both. And is it more about not replacing one with the other? Because there's a decade or so of good work, and there's also work for improvement. I fully see that. And maybe therefore it's more about creating true networks between them, and that will really result in inclusiveness, diversity, and equal participation. And so I'm more from, can we create a network of organizations, also noting they have different mandates, different participants, different memberships, to make it really work, instead of replacing one by the other. But that's my personal view, looking at it from a bit of the outside.
Yeah. Thanks, Sebastian. I hear what you say, that if you make that move and give more lead to the UN, you have to really think about the governance. What kind of institution would that become? Would it become a second, like WTO, the World Trade Organization? How about bureaucracy? Sometimes I read reports and I go to the website of the UN and I lose my way. And at the OECD, it's more clear, that there is this tax policy and administration center. And what you also said is both institutions have their pros and cons. So we will have to see how that will work out. Bo Wopke, do you have something to add? Some comments on this issue?
I can respond. Maybe slightly different perspective. So I don't have a strong opinion other than I think I'm with Sebastian that we need to cooperate, and the world is becoming more about ecosystems. I think also in this perspective, I was triggered by the comment somebody made around simplicity. I think from all the multinationals that I've worked with and we work with as a Big Four organization, there's almost no multinational that is trying to avoid taxation. Everybody wants to pay their fair share and do it in an equal way. So I think it's almost philosophical, right? We want to do it in the right way. But with all the new regulations and the diversity and the digitalization also of tax administrations, it's becoming so complex that sometimes I wonder whether we don't almost lose a lot of money in the system of tax administration instead of trying to collect the taxes so we can actually use them for what countries and also developing countries, but globally, taxes are meant for. And that's, I think, back to the remark you also made about tax and human rights. So whether that's the UN or whether that's the OECD, I think in those discussions, more attention needs to be paid to the ability, not only the rules, but and how sort of theoretically it's done, but also how in practice multinationals can deal with that, because it's becoming almost impossible to do it according to the rules, even if you want to.
Okay, thanks. I forgot to mention within the context of this question, OECD versus UN and the other way around, that there is something interesting happening in the US. And as you guys know, the US is what I call the gorilla at the table in Paris within the OECD. And these letters are very blunt, if I may use that word. And there are two letters. One letter from
the House of Representatives. It is sent to the OECD Center for Tax Policy and Administration. And they say, OECD, what are you doing with these Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, especially Pillar 1, with one of the fallback positions? You are, in fact, attacking American jobs and American tax base. And we are an important payer of fees to the OECD. So please stop every move immediately, which is not beneficial for the US. That's one letter from the House of Representatives to the OECD. Another letter is an internal letter from the Congress to certain committees. And they say the same, that what is the OECD doing? And that letter is more strongly worded. It says, please, guys, stop the contribution, which is about, I think, 80 million per year. Stop the contribution immediately to the OECD, because they are not looking at the interest of the US. So that's also something, I don't know whether it is rhetoric or there is something happening there, but the US is also not satisfied with how the OECD is dealing with this. So that's in relation to what I heard from a couple of panel members, that, the OECD is working on more inclusiveness through this inclusive framework. So let's go on to the next question. Assume that Pillar 1 will not happen. And should market countries like Indonesia, it's, the fourth country in the world in terms of population, so an interesting market. Should market countries have a plan B, and what would that look like? And what I'm thinking of, and I want to pass it on to you guys, is shall we see a revival of digital service taxes, a revival of the significant economic presence PEs? Shall we see more in Article 12b and 12a like provisions in current tax treaties through a multilateral instrument from the UN? So I would like to start with Pak Mekar. If Pillar 1 doesn't go through, is Indonesia prepared? Does it have a plan B, and how does it look like?
Thank you, Prem. Yes, we have a plan B, but we are still trying to move Pillar 1 to a consensus. So we will talk after we are done not having a consensus until the end of 2023. But make sure that we do have the plan B or plan C for this issue. Thank you, Prem.
And may I ask how that plan B and C look like?
We'll see after the end of the December 2023. As you understand that we actually have our laws that kind of DST, but it is not implemented yet. But we are going to draft a new one based on our knowledge and understanding for Pillar 1. Because now Pillar 1, it is not really discussed about digital tax, but also other things that can be considered to implement if Pillar 1 is not been signed or no MLC been signed. That is all, Prem. Thank you.
Thanks. And Pak Ferry, what is your view on, should countries have a plan B, or should they just wait and see what happens?
Yeah, thank you, Pak Prem. I think Pak Mekar already give the policy will be produced by the Ministry of Finance of Indonesia. I think the government of Indonesia already prepare. It can be seen from starting from the statute. We have the Undang-Undang HPP, the Tax Regulation Harmonization, and also the technical policies to support the statute. And also, I think because Indonesia, as you mentioned, that we are member of G20, and also we have a large investment. I think we have a lot of maybe compared to Africa countries, we are more potential in selecting or choosing which let's say opportunity that we can optimize. Yeah, but in technical, maybe as Pak Mekar explained, that we will see until the end of this year at least. Or yeah, I think that's all, Pak Prem.
Yeah, clear. Thanks. And you know, it's also a balancing act, because you can have a plan B and a plan C and going on with unilateral measures like DSTs, but then perhaps the US will knock on your door and say, hey, if you go that way, then you have serious trade and investments problems, because a country like Indonesia also needs FDIs, foreign direct investments. And we know that the US is very aggressive with, you know, coming with that argument, like what they also did, I think, recently with Kenya, Laila. They sort of influenced your president with this trade agreement between Kenya and the US. So it is a political, I think, a political balancing act. Do you have something to add, Sebastian?
Yeah, so let me first say that, of course, we hope that there is some form of consensus reached. So I think, as I said before, but it seems that we are addressing, I think, with Pillar 1, a global issue. And in my personal view, a global issue is therefore best solved with an actual global solution. And then a solution, of course, that is also consistently implemented and applied by the jurisdictions signing up to that. But I think if we hypothesize that there is no consensus and Pillar 1 fails in current form, then you're really left, I think, with obviously countries having plan B, plan C, or D. So if we are addressing a genuine issue with Pillar 1, it fails, yeah, then it needs to be solved by another solution, which is then, I think, in my personal view, unilateral or at best bilateral solutions like 12A, 12B of the UN Model Convention. And that's not per se bad, in my view. So unilateral fragmented actions, in my view, are bad because that has the potential to create chaos. But 12B, for instance, in the UN Model Convention, also has actually some simplicity to it. If you compare it to Pillar 1 with all its complexities. And so 12B, I think, is relatively simple. It does address the issue of digital presence in markets without actually having a taxable presence nowadays. And it's much more closely linked to the party that actually recognizes the income. And so it's the counterparty which you will then be taxing under 12B. You do need to insert it into bilateral treaties. So that's, I think, a complexity to actually get it implemented. But it is more simple. But my personal view would still be try to get to a global solution. If not, yeah, then countries will have plan Bs and Cs. And I think that happens not just in developing markets, but also in developed markets. So there will be then, unilateral, bilateral measures. Yeah.
Thanks, very clear. And indeed, Pillar 1, the complexity is mind-blowing. And if you look at Article 12B, it is one article with 8 or 9 or 10 paragraphs.
Yeah.
And including comments, it's around 40 pages, 45 or 40 pages, while the Pillar 1 rules and commentaries and examples, etc., also Pillar 2, it's hundreds and hundreds of pages, which is for me, as a tax expert, it is a sign that there is something fundamentally wrong with these rules. If you need hundreds of pages to solve an issue of minimum taxation or to solve the question, should market countries have a piece of the pie, then, boo wopke. Last but not least, do you have some comments to add, some thoughts?
No, I don't think specifically on this topic. I think most of the things have said, so everything I would be saying is probably repeating it in a slightly different way.
Okay, thanks. Then another question is, if Pillar 1 will not go ahead, can Pillar 2 go ahead on its own? As you guys know,
Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 are politically linked, not legally, but politically linked. It's presented as a package deal, not Pillar 2 without Pillar 1 and the other way around. So the question is, can it go ahead on its own? And if yes, Pillar 2, is it a good idea given, again, this complexity of the rules, and also the question, is it worth all the effort? Is Pillar 2 worth all the effort? Because as an example, Germany, a country like Germany, they expect for Pillar 1 only an increase in tax revenue of 0.5%, which is the question, is it worth all the effort, all the money, all the time to go ahead with Pillar 2? So question, can Pillar 2 go ahead on its own without Pillar 1? Because they are politically linked. And is it worth the effort given the complexity and what extra revenue it will take? Pak Ferry, let me start with you.
Yeah, thank you, Pak Prem. Well, basically, this is maybe the most the most person who can answer this correctly or precisely, maybe Pak Mekar, but at least I'll give you kind of my personal perspective that even though the Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 is closely linked politically, as you say, but I believe that the government of Indonesia, especially the Minister of Finance, in this case DGT, they will try to choose the policy in a very, very systematically and also prudently. because the Minister of Finance, Ibu Sri Mulyani, explained in many opportunities that we would like to to balance, right? To balance between the economic situations and also our national budget. So every single policy that the government maybe or the tax authority will choose, it will consider the let's say what we call as an equilibrium, right, between the national budget and also the economic national economic or the GDP. So if the question is, can we choose or can we apply the Pillar 2 if the Pillar 1 cannot go, then maybe Pak Mekar will answer. But that is my personal opinion, Pak Prem. I think it is proven for several times that the government of Indonesia is very prudently when we are taking or when we are choosing the several choices of policy that we should apply. Yeah, I think that's it, Pak Prem. Thank you.
Mekar, for an answer on the question, if it turns out that it is not a package deal, like having both pillars in place, P1 and P2, but P1 will not go through and we are left with P2, can it happen?
Thank you, Pak Prem. Thank you also, Pak Ferry, for your very nice explanation. Well, Pak Prem, technically, Pillar 2 may continue on its own. I don't think that is going to be a package now. Countries might optionally implement by incorporating the GLOBE rules into their respective domestic tax laws. We understand that it is beneficial to take into account all aspects when deciding to implement Pillar 2. For example, we need to estimate the potential additional tax revenues, just like the Germany. We also need to assess the impact to our current domestic tax incentives. This is the things that we are discussing right now with PKF. We also understand to calculate how many taxpayers that are already being granted tax incentive that will be in scope of implementation of Pillar 2. So administrative aspect should also be considered. Pillar 2 requires a particular GLOBE information return. This is something that need to understand by our taxpayers, because it means that the in-scope taxpayers will have additional obligations and might find the global information return will be burdensome for them. But for your question, is it possible? Yes, technically it's possible to have Pillar 2 implemented, but we still finger crossed, optimistic. Pillar 1 will be also signed. The MSL will be signed by the end of this year, at least. Thank you, Pak Prem.
For you guys, the bottle is half full. And optimism is good. There's a lot happening in the world, and we need optimism. Laila, can you give some additional comments on this question?
Yeah, I think you've also, yes. So let's look at it this way, right? As a legal move and in theory, right? So I think in theory, Pillar 2 could proceed without Pillar 1. However, it's important to note that both pillars are closely intertwined and they represent what you call a package deal that aims to address the different aspects of the international tax system. Now, both pillars are designed to address concerns about tax avoidance as well as profit shifting by multinational enterprises. However, they tackle different aspects of the problem, right? So Pillar 1 seeks to address the allocation of taxing rights, and Pillar 2 aims to ensure that profits are subjected to this minimum level of taxation. So Pillar 1, apparently, politically, theoretically, even legally, is seen as a necessary precursor to Pillar 2 because it provides that framework for determining which countries have the right to tax which multinational corporations. So while it could be possible to implement Pillar 2 without Pillar 1, doing so is going to result in a suboptimal outcome, and it will reduce the efficacy of the BEPS project overall. Now, let's turn to ATAF, right? Now, what ATAF is trying to do is that it has disconnected its entire position on connecting, right, Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. So they're proceeding with Pillar 2. And what they've done is that they have come up, they have drafted.
ATAF stands for the African Tax Administration Forum. Just for our viewers.
Indeed, yes, that's where it's a representative of all revenue authorities on the continent and tries to provide them with feasible solutions on what to do with respect to the tax system. So ATAF happens to have drafted a sort of a draft legal framework on the minimum top-up tax to advise African countries on what they need to do in order to now implement domestic laws around this, because their focus is that, okay, let's try and aim for the QDMTT, because the income inclusion rule is something that we will never be able to get. The underpaid tax payments rule is something we will never be able to get. So let's try and just focus on the minimum effective tax rate. So they're proceeding with, they've already drafted that legislation. South Africa has not applied that legislation. Nigeria has not applied it. I don't think any other African countries has applied it as yet. So they're still working towards raising awareness around why it's important to come up with this legislation to be able to get something out of Pillar 2. So they've disconnected the two. For them, it's more purely taken from a legal perspective rather than a political stance.
Thanks. Very clear, Laila. And indeed, if a country would ask my advice on if Pillar 1 doesn't go through and we are left with Pillar 2, what should we do? I would opt for the QDMTT, the Qualified Domestic Minimum Top-Up Tax, because you change the hierarchy in the rules. Without QDMTT, only the countries of the ultimate parent entities, the big multinationals, they will be able to tax, to levy the top-up tax. But with the QDMTT in place, it is the source countries which have the right to tax first. So indeed, that is an important one. And I would go for the QDMTT and leave the IIR, the inclusive rule. And the other ones, it's too technical, too complex. Just focus on the domestic minimum top-up tax and make sure it qualifies, because the OECD inclusive framework says it should qualify. So it should be drafted in line with the OECD rules. And the ATAF for African countries have already done that job. You can just copy-paste it by way of speaking in your domestic legislation. Boel Wopke, anything to add?
Well, maybe the only thing to add is that we talk about Pillar 1, Pillar 2, and the combination of both. I think if you almost take it even more holistically, what we're trying to do is address the sort of change in our global economy through digitalization, where value chains have changed over the last years. And I think most of these conversations still focus a lot on direct taxation, corporate income tax taxation, and profit, whereas there are more trends going on. The other trends that we need to bring into the mix to look at, are we doing it fairly transparent? Are we following the value change, etc.? Are the digitalization of the taxation. So the trend from, let's say, after the fact reporting to real time and really data driven. That's a big change, I think, also for multinationals, because taxation is then done almost as a pay as you earn kind of principle. That's one we need to bring into the mix. And the other one I think that we're seeing more and more is it's not so much about direct taxation anymore. There are in many countries, and especially in developing countries, but also in countries like the Netherlands, a large part of tax is being levied to indirect taxes and transactional taxes. And if you top that up with the trends around the SDGs and ESG and the shift to sort of pollution type of taxes, plastic taxes, sugar taxes, all that sort of stuff. It's the whole package, I think, that we need to keep looking at and not just focusing on the direct taxation.
Very good point, because in fact you are saying don't overhype corporate income tax. Also look at indirect taxes.
Exactly.
Which is currently the case, also with digital companies with no presence, physical presence in the market countries. Just a couple of minutes. In the market countries, they can levy VAT and more indirect taxes. So I hear what you say. Sorry, Sebastian, I have the last question is, I would like to ask each panel member, because we have heard some positive things, but mainly also negative things. Could you share with us, given your specific background, very shortly, what your experience is so far with preparing for these rules to come? Perhaps, Sebastian, I will start with you, because you are a tax director of a multinational with, I think it falls within the scope of Pillar 1.
Absolutely.
More than 20 billion, etc.
Yeah.
Okay, how do you guys prepare on all these rules?
Yeah, so we have been doing a lot of preparation. First of all, during the course of, and still ongoing actually, we try to contribute through public consultations to the dialogues on Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. And if you look at our group, so we are enormously sizable in Indonesia. So Indonesia is one of our biggest markets globally, 5,000 employees approximately, significant brands like Pepsodent, Sunlight, and Goico, and other brands which are primarily also familiar in Indonesia. But that is not only it. So we are active in 190 jurisdictions, and some are big, some are small. And what we have been doing is modeling, for instance, on Pillar 1, so to see what the impact could be to a group like us if Pillar 1 were to apply and come into force. And you actually see quite an interesting observation, because the policy intent, I think, of Pillar 1 was to tackle businesses, primarily digital businesses, which have no presence in a certain market or operate through highly centralized structures, so sort of principal models, and with little profit being left in the market jurisdictions. Well, that is actually totally the opposite from our operating model. So we have a very decentralized business model, and all of our residual profits are actually already in the market. But we are in scope of Pillar 1. So what you see in our group structure, if you model Pillar 1, is that certain market jurisdictions under Amount A, so the reallocation of residual profit, actually need to shift some of their residual profits to other market jurisdictions. Because in our case, there is no principal or central entity which can do that. So that, I think, is an observation for Pillar 1 that we observe. Yeah, when it then comes to Pillar 2, and we actually operate under the mantra of Pillar 2, 100% happening.
Yeah.
We are doing actually a lot. So we have been educating our tax teams. We have been engaging with different functions within Unilever, so accounting, but also legal. And then we have also been trying to assess whether we need changes to IT systems or whether we can extract it from our existing systems. In our case, we can extract largely from existing systems, so that's good. But we also need to do a lot of education, because the whole basis of Pillar 2 does not start with your traditional way of calculating your taxable income. It's a group accounting standard, which is very, very different from what you typically see in local financial statements or tax calculations today. And so there's enormous learning curve that we are going through as well. And I think what we have been doing that's quite helpful, there's also been safe harbors, so the country by country safe harbor. And while we start with 190 jurisdictions in our group, if you do these country by country safe harbors, you actually come to somewhere in the 10 or 20 markets for which we actually need to do Pillar 2 calculation. So I think safe harbors at the same time are a simplification. And to briefly say something about the other point, I think it's absolutely logical as well. I agree with you on implementing QDMTTs in markets. And I think what ATAF has been doing with very simple paper, actually, of 30 pages to guide African countries on how to do that, I think is a very logical step. Yeah.
Okay, given the time, I had a last question about panel members ending with a positive note, but we don't have the time. I will end with a positive note. I think the new tax systems, the global pillars, they are an unprecedented opportunity for the profession and job certainty. So for the young people, the students behind Pekka and Stan, take that into account, because tax rules, the legal rules and accounting are growing towards each other. And I cannot follow that anymore at my age. I can read the technical things, but after 5 pages, it goes zoom above my head. What is happening here? And you need some accountancy background. So I think for young people, this is really an opportunity. Okay. Thank you. And I think we have a Paul F. question.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, what an interesting discussion. Thank you very much, Mr. Prem Kumar Baldasing and all discussants who have discussed regarding the 2 global pillars in overcoming BEPS or BEPS. We're gonna back to you later for the Q&A session, but before that, ladies and gentlemen, in the beginning of the event, we have polled in the poll of question session, which had been led by Gary from Capabuild. Apparently, everybody is missing Gary right now. So I'm going to recall him to continue his poll of question session. All right, Gary, the time is yours.
Thank you very much, Ibu Dian, and thank you so much to our panelists, and thank you to Pak Prem for moderating that session. For me, listening in, it was a fascinating insight into all the different views that are held by, we have private sector, by government, by academics. So it was a very interesting discussion. And it's something that at Capabuild, we love to hear all these different views. We don't believe that there is one truth. And along that truth, what we are doing now is asking you how much knowledge you have maybe gained throughout this discussion. We have had a couple of presentations from Pak Ferry Irwan, as well as the panel discussion. So in the chat is the Pollev link. So we ask you to please go to that Pollev link, and now the panelists can actually view what is happening with those responses. And you can see that there has been quite a major shift in the understanding. I remind you that at the start of the webinar, we had 67% who answered A here to the top response, which was I know virtually nothing. That has been reduced to 17%. So around about half of the participants, and we have many, many participants, about half have moved from the I know virtually nothing up to I have a basic knowledge, which was at 25% before. And so that has now jumped, about 20% have gone into there. And what's fantastic is the increase in the in-depth knowledge. That finished at around about 2%. So around about 10% of our respondents now consider themselves to be well-versed and fully understanding. Probably one of the main points of interest is answer D, which is that a lot of the respondents feel that they are beyond a basic knowledge. So Pak Prem and the panelists, congratulations, especially Pak Irwan. Thank you for moving the knowledge barometer here, which is such an important part of what we are doing today. So Pak Prem, Ibu Dian, I beg your pardon, back to you. A very positive result there.
All right. Thank you very much, Gary, for the poll of question session. We're getting back to our panelists for the question and answer session. So I recall for Mr. Prem Kumar Baldasing. The time is yours.
Yes, thank you. I have some questions in front of me, and I will pass them on to either all or some of the panel members. The first question is, with the implementation of a large threshold, 20 billion euros, can the tax potential from the implementation of these two pillars be optimized? Do we understand this question? Pak Ferry, perhaps you understand it? Can you?
Yeah. Yeah, maybe the question is because we have the threshold, the amount is maybe too big for compared to countries worldwide. So maybe the questions, the objective of the question is to ask the effectivity or the efficiency of the policy, the pillar one, especially the pillar one. Yeah. And maybe that is the question, Pak Prem. Yeah. I beg your pardon, I can hear the voice. Pak Prem.
The question is whether the implementation of a large threshold can the tax potential be optimized? Yeah. What would your answer be, Pak Ferry?
Yeah.
That question.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. Thank you for the question. In my opinion, because the threshold, the amount of threshold is determined by the IF or the OECD, and then it considers several variables or factors, and maybe not. Maybe it's a limited countries or firm can achieve this amount, right? So maybe the question is how effective to boost the tax revenue, Pak. So in my opinion, maybe directly, it might not impact the tax revenue, but indirectly, I mean indirectly means that we know that the structure of a business, every large companies, let's say the Unilever, okay, it should have the supporting companies, right? The supporting firms that support the Unilever and the other large multinational companies. Yes, indirectly we can optimize the tax revenue. I mean, by implementing, especially the pillar one, because the question said 20 billion euro. Yeah, so it's the pillar one. And then especially in the digital taxation, yes, we can optimize. And maybe Pak Mekar can explain in a more technical or in a detailed way. But in conceptual, I can say that yes, we can optimize the tax revenue. Yeah.
I think it has to do. Yeah. I think it has to do with your situation as an important market country.
Yes, for sure.
These huge multinationals, including Unilever, they have a lot of business. They have a lot of clients there. As I said in the beginning, within the scope of Pillar 1 are only around 100 multinationals, and at least half of which is US based. So you will see a shift from those headquarters countries to market countries. That's the intention of Pillar 1, to give market countries a piece of the pie. So in that sense, it will optimize it will increase your tax revenue. Another question is,
Pak Prem, maybe
I think this is a question for Laila. Yeah, Do the implementation of two pillars be beneficial for state revenue, especially for developing and least developed countries?
Okay, thank you. So initially, what I also wanted to say is that, we first have to agree that there are more than 100 multinational enterprises operating worldwide, but the threshold of 20 billion is kind of just shrinking the space to just about 100 MNEs. And I love statistics because I think with statistics, you're able to really look at the implications of these issues and also discuss and say, okay, is it optimal? Is it not? So Kenya has only 11 multinational enterprises. If Kenya was to implement Pillar 1, it would be able to subject those 11 multinationals to the tax threshold because it meets the 20 billion plus the 10% profit margin. But at the same time, Kenya has 89 more multinational corporations operating domestically that just fall below the threshold. So having imposed the unilateral measure of the digital service tax, we were able to tax 1.5% on these multinational corporations, and we generated about 448 million Kenya shillings, which is about, this is my bad math, say $3 million. Now look at the implications of this amount, right? 448 million Kenya shillings is equivalent to setting up about 6 level 3 public health facilities, which each costs 70 million Kenya shillings. So by not implementing Pillar 1, we've been able to impose unilateral measures and generate that income. So it shows that with unilateral measures, our fiscal space can actually improve. But having to implement Pillar 1 and Pillar 2, there were statistics I had shared earlier on during, the initial, when we started talking, and I talked about the TJN report, whereby we said that by implementing these pillars, low-income countries' tax take would be 3% compared to 60% of the global north. Right? So it's not beneficial in terms of implementing it for the continent. Another thing is that by getting the global minimum tax to the 15% would mean that we're now giving away our corporate tax rights, that tax sovereignty that we require to broaden our fiscal space, to a race to the bottom by reducing it to 15% minimum. Right. So there's good and bad towards this because, it kind of gets rid of that aspect of secrecy jurisdictions and tax havens. But in the long run, it's not beneficial for the continent. And then I shared the statistics from the Oxford Economic Report, which basically said that by having this threshold would mean that we're not going to be able to generate enough income. The income that we would generate with the proposals made by ATAF, for example, to just have the profit reallocation from 25 to 30% would generate 857 million US dollars for the African continent. Some of this is really important because look, to finance climate mitigation and adaptation activities on the continent, we need about 1.3 trillion US dollars. To implement SDGs, we also need $1 trillion. Now, what we can get out of profit reallocation from a move from 25 to 35% would give us 857 million US dollars, which is the kind of money that we actually need to be able to sustain our livelihoods on the continent. So not to sidetrack the entire discussion, but that's practically the view that we're kind of losing our fiscal space, fiscal sovereignty, and also those tax brackets by trying to implement Pillar 1 and Pillar 2. I am definitely a mover for unilateral measures because they work and they generate the income that we require.
Yeah, clear. And there is a question linked with this one. And Laila, it's for you. For African countries, what are the options that they will take if they are not going to be using the OECD pillars?
Okay, so this is a politically charged question, right? Because sometimes there's some countries on the continent that cannot make decisions because they're tied within the bilateral investment treaties and the double taxation agreements that they have signed with other countries. So for them to be able to change to a different plan other than Pillar 1 and Pillar 2 and to try and tax foreign corporates more, they have to go back to the negotiating table. But beyond that, the best way forward for African countries is to impose unilateral measures, just like what Kenya has done, Nigeria has done, and other African countries are beginning to do. This is imposing the digital service tax, right? Because this is something you have control over. Now, suppose there's heavy opposition against imposing the digital service tax, then let's move to what the UN has recommended. So the UN model adopted Article 12B which deals with income from automated digital services. And I think digitalization is really taking over the world at such a breakneck speed that we need to be on board in terms of designing our fiscal systems on how to go about taxing this sphere. So if we can't impose DST because of the political difficulties that we might have, then let's work with Article 12B and try and impose that within our tax treaties, within our BITs, and the discussions with the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreements that we're going to be having going forward. Because Article 12B, for example, it allows for gross basis taxation, for instance, by withholding tax on cross-border payments with respect to services such as online advertising. There's so much of that going on the continent, intermediation, social media, digital content provision, cloud computing, sale of, data of users of a digital interface. So the inclusion of Article 12B as part of the African tax system, right? Even if it was ostensibly adopted with the interests of developing countries in mind by seeking to preserve their taxing rights in a simpler way than Pillar 1, it is a more principled and broader reform measure that can be applied to many sectors that have been digitalized. So that is the way forward. Either impose digital taxation services, which I think Kenya has also just recently published its Finance Act 2023, where it has broadened the tax sphere to include some of these cloud computing, automated digital services as part of taxation within Kenya. So that's unilateral measures. And then Article 12, that's what I can think on the top of my head.
It's also, a warning towards countries. You can have a multilateral instrument like what the UN is working on, including Article 12B, but you need to make sure that it is first implemented in your domestic law, because you may have the right to tax, but if your domestic law doesn't allow that or is missing, then you have the right, but you cannot do anything, because it's your domestic law which says what you can tax. Sebastian, I think I have a question related to you as a business representative, and that deals with competition. Like Pillar 2 tries to end competition between countries by setting this floor of at least 15% effective tax rate. And this question says, what shall we expect for tax competition and non-tax competition in the near future? So what we know currently is that, especially in developing countries who are heavily reliant on corporate income tax, they give a lot of tax incentives like tax holidays, lower tax rate, depreciation, etc., etc. And through this minimum 15%, multinationals have to pay overall 15%. So from your perspective as a tax director, do you look at tax incentives when you want to invest in a country, or is it commerciality first and then tax?
Yeah, very good question. I think there are a couple of sub-questions in your question, actually. And I think for us as a group, it's commerciality or business rationale first. And then when we do decide to invest, for instance, in a factory in country X, then we will be involved from tax to see whether that also has certain incentives which align with the commercial intent of our investment locally. Now, if you look at Pillar 2 and what the potential impact of that could be on country incentive regimes, then I think Pillar 2 is indeed putting a floor to sort of the corporate minimum tax of 15%. So if you had a tax holiday, and probably if the tax holiday can be broken up, so there's legal agreements, of course, for tax holiday, but if that can be broken up, you will be subject to this 15% tax. And then what you see, I think, in some jurisdictions, and they're actually quite open about it, is that they are going to use that incremental revenue to actually give back to companies through other types of incentives. And so I think a consequence of Pillar 2 could be, it remains to be seen, that on the one hand, you have direct taxation being floored to, let's say, at minimum 15%. but then actually see that revenue being given back to companies in the form of other things. So subsidies, grants, wage tax incentives, refundable tax credits, which are good credits under Pillar 2. So I think you will get a new mix of incentives, which is attracting more importance at the expense of potentially corporate income tax incentives. And I think some markets are actually quite open about looking at these opportunities and assessing these. So Singapore, I think, has been quite open about it, Thailand as well. And so you see some, I think, markets being actually open and addressing that issue.
Yeah, and I've read that a country like Vietnam, it really has a problem because they give a lot of tax incentives to attract FDIs, and with Pillar 2, these tax incentives, they will be levied at the headquarters countries if they don't do anything. So behind my question is also the question, is it really about having tax incentives? Because if you have an interesting market as a multinational, like Vietnam or Indonesia, you want to sell your products, that I think has a higher priority than possibly having some tax incentives. What is your experience?
I think that's right. So I think, and that's what I tried to say. So I think it's the commercial business decision to launch a product in our case, or to invest in a factory, or to do other kinds of investments in a market. And then tax comes second. So tax can only improve basically your business case of an investment to make it more favorable after tax, then is really the driving factor. So that I think is my personal view. So commercial business drives the investments, and then tax comes as a helpful element, but it comes second. And I think, as I said, I think Pillar 2 will result in a different mix of incentives being explored by markets. So for instance, in your Vietnam example, if that were to be an issue, then I can imagine they look for other incentives to attract FDI for companies to like level play field.
Subsidies.
Subsidies or grants.
Not a reduction in tax, but subsidies.
Exactly.
Is that also your experience with your clients, Wopke?
Yeah, it's tax follows the business. So and that has changed, I think, over 20 years I've been in the profession. So no, the simple answer is tax follows the business. And I agree, you see also the trend more from tax incentives to subsidies. And I think trying to do it in that way. I also think there are many companies that don't even look into subsidies and tax incentives. Mm-hmm. So there's also the question on how effective are these regulations. That depends a lot, I think, on the multinational, how they're organized, how they're dealing with grants and incentives, because that's typically not the topic that is well organized within multinationals.
Yeah, and I also understand within the framework of Pillar 2 that there is a substance carve out. So if you are having business in a country and you pay effectively less than 15%, but your business goes hand in hand with substance, that it doesn't matter that you pay less than 50% because it is carved out from the Pillar 2 rules. Is that also something you guys are looking at, Sebastian?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. So that substance-based income inclusion, I think it's called in the rules, is something which looks at your presence in a market in terms of substance. So it looks at employee costs and I think tangible assets. And then based on that, you can calculate a certain income which is excluded from Pillar 2 calculations effectively. So if your entire income is related to income which is substance-based excluded, then indeed Pillar 2 becomes non-effective in that market. And that has also been modeled. I think in our case, we have looked at that. It's part of the rules to assess our impact of Pillar 2. I think one item which stands out there is that the level of employee costs also depends, of course, on the employee base in a certain market. So if you look again at sort of the developed versus developing market difference, then I think in developed markets, you will see higher employee salary costs, generally speaking, because higher salaries, versus developing markets, lower salaries. So your substance-based income inclusion, although you have the same number of people, can actually be lower because of this differentiating factor in the level of salaries in a certain market. So that's another observation we had with the substance-based income inclusion. But yes, we have looked at that, we have modeled that, and it does produce certain results. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, let me see. We have 1 minute. I think we can end here, if that's okay, and give it back to the overall moderator. Thanks, everyone from the panel, for their input.
All right, thank you very much, Mr. Prem Kumar Baldasing and all discussants who have answered the question that has been asked by participants. Ladies and gentlemen, finally we have come to the end of the event. We hope that this forum will give beneficial impact and significant changes in taxation system in Indonesia. Thank you so much for joining us today, and I will remind you that every participant should fill the attendance form that has been given to you. And the attendance form will be closed in 1 hour, so please don't miss it. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm Dian Puspa, your host once again. Thank you very much. Wassalamualaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. In YouTube participants, you can fill the attendance form by linktree.internationalwebinar PRPN 2023. One more time, linktree.internationalwebinar PRPN 2023. Thank you very much.